It was 7 weeks ago that Vladimir Putin launched a special military operation against Ukraine with this chilling speech.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
For the people of Ukraine, it was the ominous start to a brutal invasion that has since killed thousands. But to many Syrians, it harked back to September 30th, 2015, when Russian jets began bombing them. In that country, Russian aggression and atrocities have been a way of life ever since. Russian President Vladimir Putin had launched his Middle East campaign to prop up Syria's Bashar al-Assad in that dictator's civil war against an array of rebel groups. Said Putin, quote, "Our task is to stabilize the legitimate government and create conditions for the search for a political compromise." But within just a few months, beginning in 2016, Russia was credibly accused by human rights groups of deliberately bombing schools, hospitals, and civilian homes in rebel-held territory. One group concluded that Russian bombs had killed hundreds more civilians than rebels. And according to watchdogs, not just conventional bombs, but also Russian cluster munitions, incendiary bombs, and thermobaric weapons used on civilians, an apparent war crime. Sound familiar? It gets worse, much worse. By summer of 2016, Assad's forces surrounded Aleppo, Syria's most populous city, one of the oldest still existing cities in human history, and a haven for rebel groups. After a stalemate that lasted for months, Russian jets began to flatten the city, with hundreds of thousands of civilians still living inside of it. A warning, some of this footage may be disturbing to some viewers.
The street seems frozen in the moment the shells came in. Most of the footage is too distressing to show. The sound of desperation, trying to save someone caught under collapsed masonry, and the sound of people in deep shock. Scenes being played out over and over again in a city that's become synonymous with carnage and misery.
That was on day 2 of a month-long Russian campaign that reportedly killed thousands of innocent people. A horror eerily reminiscent of what Russian forces are now doing to Mariupol, a Ukrainian city of 400,000 residents surrounded and still under siege after weeks of Russian shelling. A city where a maternity hospital was bombed, a theatre housing women and children was destroyed, and civilian escape routes have been repeatedly shut down by Russian artillery. Putin's punishing attack has created more than 4 million refugees who fled Ukraine and has displaced 3 million more people inside the country, making it the largest refugee crisis in the world since, you guessed it, Syria. In fact, in the past decade, Putin may have displaced more human beings than any single leader since Adolf Hitler. In both Syria and Ukraine, there have been allegations that rape has been used as a weapon of war. The people of both countries live under the constant threat of chemical weapons, a threat that Assad made good on in Syria repeatedly, according to the UN and US intelligence. And in both wars, the Russian propaganda machine is hard at work. In Syria, Russia focused its anger on the white helmets, the residents who volunteered to find and evacuate the wounded and to document apparent war crimes. The Kremlin and its army of online bots falsely accused all the white helmets of working with al-Qaeda and of staging atrocities with crisis actors. And now in Ukraine, Russia says videos depicting its war crimes there are really fakes made by Ukrainian neo-Nazis. No, really, that's straight from this Russian state media story with the headline, "Ukrainian neo-Nazis film staged videos to frame Russian forces for war crimes." Utter insanity. But the darkest parallel of all may be this. The tone for the Russian campaign in Syria was set by its first commander, Alexander Dvornikov. All the indiscriminate killing, the use of forbidden munitions, the death, the destruction, on his watch earned Dvornikov an award from Putin, but earned him in the Western media the nickname the Butcher of Syria. Now, guess who Putin has tapped as the new commander for the next phase of his failing war effort in Ukraine? That's right, the Butcher of Syria. And Dvornikov's appointment has convinced many observers that the dark similarities between Russia's two wars are about to grow even worse. In fact, many Syrians are reaching out to Ukrainian organizations with advice on how to cope with the hell of war and how to document Russian atrocities. There's also the similarity in the American response to both wars in Syria and in Ukraine, agonizing over whether or how much to arm rebel groups, as well as whether to impose a no-fly zone. In both conflicts, the US government and its allies have been keen to call out Russia for its war crimes, but keener still, understandably, to avoid a direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed Putin.
My hope is that as we continue to have these conversations, and as I suspect Russia starts realizing that they're not going to be able to bomb their way to a peaceful situation inside of Syria, that we'll be able to make progress on that front.
Russia is still trying to bomb its way out of everything in Syria and Ukraine. But again, you can't fault any American administration for wanting to avoid a hot war with Putin. Nuclear escalation is a legitimate concern, and it's a serious challenge to what we all feel when we see the images of horrors and hardships in Ukraine today, just like the atrocities we witnessed for over a decade in Syria. Look, I get it. You cannot help but look at the awful violence brought down upon innocent populations by Vladimir Putin in both Syria and Ukraine and want to do something about it, want to do something about him. I don't want a world war in a nuclear age. Neither should you. But we've seen this all before, and so we shouldn't be surprised at the extent of the Russian brutality in Ukraine. Syrians aren't. Nevertheless, short of escalation and a possible nuclear conflict, is there anything at all that can be done right now to make sure that never again doesn't again become never mind? Joining me now is writer, novelist, and foreign policy analyst Rula Jebreal, as well as Jomana Qaddour, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and co-founder of Syria Relief and Development. Thank you both for joining me. Rula, let me start with you. We're hearing numerous reports of sexual assaults by Russian soldiers in Ukraine. In fact, this week, Ukrainian activists accused Russia of using rape as a weapon of war. What does that mean, and what precedent is there for that in the Syrian war?
Well, Human Rights Watch, but also the United Nations, has been documenting rape in detention centers and rape of women and children and prisoners of all kinds. But, you know, Mehdi, if we look at Russian history, Russian colonialism has been deploying the same occupation and invasion tactics all over the world, not only in Syria or Ukraine. If you look what they did in Finland, in Estonia, in Lithuania, in Azerbaijan, in Afghanistan, it's always the same tactic. What happened in Syria is the regime was already deploying those kind of tactics. We know every regime in the Middle East, anytime you're arrested, even a regime like Sisi, where under his rule, you have people, 60,000 prisoners, they're being raped as we speak. They always use that methodology. So when Russia intervened in Syria, they basically did exactly what Assad was doing, but also they've been famous in history. I mean, after World War II, even historians document what they did after the liberation from the Nazi in Germany and in Europe, where they had a massive rape campaign. So this is not a new method. They always use that. What happened in Syria, the scale of slaughtering and rape of civilians, we can actually rival it or compare it to what happened in Bosnia and in Rwanda combined. And we have documentation of that. I mean, the United Nations have all these documents. We have more evidence against the Russian regime and Syrian regime than we had against the Nazis. But what happened, the fact that we never acted and there was never accountability, this paved the way for what's happening in Ukraine today. So
let me bring in Jomana. Jomana, Russian attacks on hospitals and schools and residential areas in Ukraine were well documented before Putin appointed this new general, Alexander Dvornikov, to run the war. As someone who watched him work in Syria, what could this tell us about the direction, the dark direction of things in Ukraine now?
Well, thank you, Mehdi, for having me. Of course, I mean, I think Syrian doctors, nurses, humanitarian workers, we've seen most recently the white helmets publish in the Washington Post saying, we know how this ends. The Russians are going to try to convince you to be part of a deconfliction mechanism, for example, at the United Nations. They're going to try to push things like UN Security Council resolutions, also that they can have veto power over the work that is the direction of that Russia would like to push this war. I spoke just very recently before this with doctors who were, for example, responsible for the evacuation of Aleppo, who said, you know, now as we look at Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities under siege, we are incredibly worried because they were trying at the time to negotiate via the UN with the Russians to allow even the most severe of medical patients to be able to be afforded safe exit, dialysis patients, patients with tumors, none of which were given those guarantees by the Russians, and in fact were targeted on their way out of Aleppo. And so we absolutely know where this ends, even when communities give up and say, please just stop the shelling. We're going to evacuate. We will agree to be displaced. Even in those situations, civilians fear for their lives.
Rula, let me ask you this. Where do you stand on the military option here? Because another similarity, as I pointed out earlier, the Obama administration agonized over a no-fly zone over parts of Syria as Syrians were being killed en masse on the grounds that they wanted to avoid a conflict, a direct conflict with Russian jets. That's what the Biden administration is saying now. That's a legitimate argument, isn't it? Or do you think they're too cautious?
They're too cautious. He's not going to stop in Ukraine. I mean, we need to start understanding how this man is reasoning. His propagandists, day in and day out, on national television, on state television, are telling us that they are at war with the West. They are at war with Europe. They even advocate dropping atomic bombs against Europe. They even brag about Putin, bragging about rape. He used actually a song where he was telling his soldiers, and this is military coded language, where he said, my beauty, it's your duty. So he's bragging.
Understood, Rula, but you don't worry that a no-fly zone could lead to a nuclear escalation.
So if they don't want no-fly zone, there's two other options that we need actually to start pushing forthwith. One, arming Ukrainians, whatever they need to protect themselves. We have a responsibility to protect, because we saw in Syria, the principle of never again became never mind, and then Syria became another genocide that is now taking place in Ukraine. Another thing, we need to push Europeans, especially Germans, to stop funding Putin's war machine. They're sending him, they send Ukrainians $1 billion and then hundreds of billions of dollars to the regime. Does not make sense. So sanctions, 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 but above all, arming Ukrainians.
I think many people would agree with both those things. I think where they worry about is a direct confrontation, which was the same worry, sadly, in Syria. Jomana, one last question to you. One big difference between Syria and Ukraine is the amount of sympathy on display in the Western world, especially when it comes to refugees fleeing the conflict. We've talked on this show about the double standard before when it comes to Syrian refugees versus Ukrainian refugees. I wonder what you, as a Syrian-born American woman running, a non-profit on the ground in Syria, must be maddening to watch.
Yeah. Listen, I'm not going to say that there isn't a part of me that doesn't wish that the resounding, welcoming that Ukrainians have received in Europe wasn't extended and afforded to Syrians. But at the same time, Mehdi, if you'll allow me, I will tell you that Syrians I know in the diaspora, across Europe, in the United States, in the region, their hearts are with Ukrainians. They said, the world did not step in and save us, but please, we hope the world does everything it can to stop Russia, to stop Putin, to weaken Putin. Because if they are able to weaken him in Ukraine, this will have reverberations in Syria. It will have reverberations in Georgia. The thing that will make Syrians happy is to not watch Russian domination of Syria after Ukraine. We'd love to see Putin, not be part of Syria again, just be in Syria's past, not its future.
Jomana, that was perfectly put. Thank you so much, Jomana Qaddour, Rula, Jebreal. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you both.